Do you want to go ahead and introduce Ramah, please?
Yeah, sure. We've only met once. It was back in 2018. I was a member of the IWW and on their General Defense Committee, and I was struggling. I ended up joining them, even though I've been a Marxist-Leninist all my life, because they were the only ones that took fascism seriously. And I was trying to figure out what was going on with the rest of the left, with over Russia and all the rest of it. And my new comrades didn't think it was their fight, but they turned out to be wrong about that. But one guy I met there was on a similar quest, and he introduced me to Terry Burke, who had been fighting with Russia indirectly for years over Syria. You know, she and a bunch of other Syrian activists were able to tell me quite a bit about the influence of Russia on the left in the United States. And it was through her that I went to hear Ramah Kudaimi speak in 2018. And you know, the clarity of her presentation, she's been active in the Palestinian struggle. She's a Syrian American that grew up in Chicago. She's an avid sports fan. I follow her on Twitter, and her pinned tweet is, Palestine helps us separate the liberals from the socialists, and Syria helps us further sort through the socialists for real revolutionaries versus the ideologues. She phrased it much more gracefully than that, but I've been following her, and I just think her perspective on both the geopolitics of the Middle East and the role of Russia, but also the internationalist perspective of supporting the victims in Syria, you know, and other parts of the Middle East. She's got a very, very holistic view of what's going on, and I think you'll really enjoy listening to her.
I'm sorry, I just got a phone call from someone who's trying to get into the meeting. John, are you there?
Yes.
Monique is trying to get into the meeting. Do you see somebody who's trying to be let in?
No, anybody that's trying to get in can get in. Hold on just 1 second, Cheryl. I'm gonna.
Okay.
Well, if it's possible that I can share my screen, someone can do that for me. I just realized I don't, it's disabled, but I can start as someone figures out, and I don't need it if it's too much of a hassle.
You can screen share now.
Okay. Thank you so much. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. Really honored to be spending these next hour and a half, 2 hours with you all, especially as we mark 1 year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think it's an important moment to reflect back on and I'll discuss the kind of the connections between Syria and Ukraine and other places where, you know, awful oppression and occupation is happening. So my name, as Linda introduced, is Ramah Kudaimi. I'm a Syrian American activist, born and raised in the suburbs of Chicago. I currently live right outside DC. My family is, my parents were both raised in Damascus. My mom's family is originally from Hama, which is like an hour and a half north of Damascus. And yeah, I think I definitely, you know, grew up spending my summers in Syria to see my grandparents and my cousins and aunts and uncles. I still have family there as well, and then haven't sadly been able to go back since the start of the revolution. And I think the context we're coming in together at this moment is obviously the earthquake. It's been about 3 weeks now since the earthquake hit Turkey and Syria. I think the latest death toll is 50,000 people. It's just an incredible number, and millions more displaced, including millions, you know, of those millions are Syrians who themselves have been displaced from their homelands already. And this earthquake has brought a lot of attention back to Syria. I think Syria has been in the background for a couple of years now, even though the war continues. And it's important, I think, as people are talking about the earthquake, that we bring back the context. Why is this humanitarian disaster impacting Syria, specifically whether they are in regime-held parts of Syria like Aleppo, in the northwest parts of Syria, which are free from regime control. So we're talking about places like Idlib, or now the millions of Syrian refugees living in Turkey themselves that are now, I think of that, the 50,000 number, the majority of them are in Turkey, but countless numbers of those are also Syrian refugees who've been forced to flee. So next month is going to mark 12 years since the people of Syria rose up against the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Since, in the aftermath of that uprising, northwest Syria has been bombed nonstop for years by both Assad and Putin, and bombing that didn't even stop after the earthquake. There's been several reports that parts of northwest Syria have been bombed by the regime since the earthquake itself. And it's important to note that that part of Syria is not only home to people who lived there pre-revolution, but also people who've been displaced from across Syria and forcibly displaced. The regime had, and we'll talk more details about this throughout the presentation, but the regime had for years a policy of sieging different cities across Syria. And the only way they would end the siege if there's an agreement that rebels and their families and people who are opposed to the regime would be forcibly displaced to northwest Syria. And so we're talking about, again, people who are impacted, being displaced already from their homes and now being displaced again. Before the earthquake, there were major snowstorms. So people who are already, again, living in camps and tents had been dealing with these snowstorms, and now they have this other disaster happening. Hospitals, which had been a major target by Assad and Putin, and purposefully targeted, the UN would tell them these are the coordinates of the hospitals, and then they would bomb anyways, and the UN would not learn from their mistakes. We'll talk more about the UN, and continue to give them the coordinates, and they would continue to bombing the hospital, to the point that people started building hospitals underground to be safe from the airstrikes. And sadly, because of the earthquake now, several of those hospitals themselves have been destroyed. The regime has used this earthquake as an opportunity to spread its propaganda, oftentimes sadly supported by many people who proclaim to be progressive and left in the US and beyond. So probably the biggest claim we've seen circulating on social media is around the issue of sanctions, and that's a major reason why aid isn't reaching Syria as quickly as it needs to be. It's not, I can't simply say, yes, sanctions have no impact. They do have somewhat of impact, particularly because many times services like PayPal and Venmo will be extra careful and be like, no, you cannot send any aid if you put Syria in the memo. I've been a victim of that. I've one time sent some support to, it wasn't even to Syria. I sent to someone in Greece, and I forgot, and I put in the memo for Syria refugees, and my PayPal account was for a whole year, I could not they kept telling me, warning, we're looking into your account, etc. And so these are issues that are real, and that predate Syria. It's a legacy of Islamophobia, particularly in a post 9/11 world of banks and other financial services, just blanketing any Muslims who are doing any charity work as quote unquote terrorists. So that is a reality. The problem is that's not the reality that people are discussing. What people are discussing is, the sanctions, US sanctions are the problem, in a way to deflect blame from the regime, to deflect blame from the UN, and really push forward this idea that the US is the problem, because so many times progressive and leftists in the US just want to center ourselves, and so make ourselves the problem, when the reality that's not. It's more complicated than that. Aid was slow to get in because for so long the regime has proclaimed everyone in northwest Syria as quote unquote terrorists, which scares people away from giving. International bodies like the UN have allowed the regime to control aid deliveries Russia has several times regularly vetoed any efforts to open more humanitarian corridors. And so I think that's like part of these conversations and why it's important to think back in this moment in time and talk about the context of Syria, talk about why we've gotten here. And so that's what I'm going to spend like the next, about 40 minutes talking about, and then open it up, lot for discussion, questions, conversation. Love to hear also, from you all as well. And it's so important. And I think we're gonna, throughout, we're gonna at the also ask folks potentially to, I think we discussed donating, to where's to donate, one organization to think about donating to, especially considering that there's so much complexity about getting aid and not aid. Whenever we can try to get aid to people directly on the ground, is much means that folks are able to get that money and rebuild their lives. And so it's a group that we were gonna highlight, and I just want to mention them in case people have to jump off early, is Mulham Team, who is named after an activist from Latakia, who was martyred during the revolution. And I know they've been covering essential needs for those impacted by the earthquake, trying to help people rebuild their homes. So just want to drop their name. It's MOLHAM and then team, and we can drop a link as well. But as to get into there, like I said, I want to kind of step back and talk about what's, and are folks being able to see my slideshow?
Yes, yes.
Perfect. So much focus, unfortunately, in recent years is on violence, it's on death. And when I do my presentations, I like to take people back, like, let's focus on the people who are living through this. What are their lives like? What were their lives like? So, Bashar al-Assad, who's the current president, he became president in 2000, inherited power from his father. Hafez al-Assad, who died in 2000, his father had been in power since 1970. So they've now been, the Assad regime has been in power for 50 plus years. His father was also a brutal regime. Probably one of the most brutal acts his father enacted was the massacre in Hama in 1982. So that's where my mom's family is from, where it was estimated that they killed 20 to 40,000 people within a short span of a couple weeks. And it was to the point that people never talked about this massacre. That's how scared people were of the brutality of it. It was something that, even in my family, very rarely talked about it. Even though we didn't grow up, me and my siblings didn't grow up in Syria, we would go visit a lot, but we knew that like there were certain things we should not talk about, the moment we got there. We knew even when we're not in Syria to be careful of who we're talking to and not talking to, because they were regime spies that may potentially report back about what our family was and was not saying. And then that would put us at risk if when we went back, or potentially put our family there at risk. There was a small bit of opening when Bashar took power in 2000. People call it the Damascus Spring, where there was hope that like, okay, finally, maybe, Bashar is like, someone who was educated in the West. He's a ophthalmologist. Like maybe, he'll take, he's not the one who was being groomed, honestly, to take over after his father. His other brother, Basil was killed, and then his brother Maher, who has become really who's more of the violent war criminal at this point than Bashar al-Assad at some points, was not, I think, all that, but like, so there was some hope, and there was some, the Damascus String, where people started speaking more. There were people, meeting, doing kind of political things, social things that like, okay, this is an opportunity. And then quickly that was clamped down on. The regime likes to claim that it is anti-imperialist, and that is why it is the focus of so much from the West in terms of regime change. But the reality is very different. During the 1990s, there were major peace talks with Israel between Syria and Israel. After both, Egypt made peace in the 70s, and then Jordan made peace, and then it was like Syria's the next one. They took part in the CIA's rendition program post 9/11. So folks have heard of the case of Maher Arar, who was sent to Syria to be tortured. He's a Canadian who was sent to Syria by the US government to be tortured on behalf of them, and then eventually released. And just his story is very awful in terms of what he went through. But again, there's this like these linkages between Assad, who proclaims to be anti-Western, and then working with the CIA. He neoliberalized the economy, started neoliberalizing the economy, and then, for decades, including obviously during these last 10, 15 years, Israel has been bombing Syria several times. And obviously Assad has always been like, oh, we'll respond one day, never actually responded. And then Palestine continues to be like proclaim like we are the supporters of Palestine. Palestinians have been, caught up in this conflict as well. Since, major Palestinian refugee camps, including Yarmouk camp, right outside of Damascus, have been bombed by the regime. And so I think people need to remember when we talk about Syria of like what was happening across the region back in March of 2011. We had Mohamed Bouazizi, the Tunisian street vendor who set himself on fire in December of 2010, in protest of police brutality, in protest of the awful economic conditions him and his fellow country people were going through. And that set off, what has been named the Jasmine Revolution. Protests occurred. And President Ben Ali at the time, who was, I think at the time was the longest standing authoritarian dictator of the region, was forced to flee. And then the uprisings spread to Egypt, to Libya, to Yemen, to Bahrain, to Syria, and other parts of the world. And I think that's an important context, because people always talk about the region as if, oh, this is just, they think about the US invasion of Iraq. And something changed in those early months of 2011 and then through 2012, where people were able to kind of, seize back the control of their lives and kind of break that barrier of fear that they were facing against their dictators, who were able to use, again, things like the invasion of Iraq of just like, do you want this to happen to you? We're protecting you from these types of things. And, a lot of people in Syria, I remember early in the days, people were like, oh, Syria's next. And I'd be like, absolutely not. Like, there's no way. Like, there's just too much fear there. There's too much barriers that folks had to break in order to be there. And what happened is people they were inspired. They saw what was happening and they decided to start protesting. And the protest started in Daraa, the southeast part of the country, on the border with Jordan. They're a very agricultural area, but had been dealing with, socioeconomic issues like youth and unemployment. There was a drought happening that also forced people, led to a socioeconomic issue where people were even more frustrated than they usually are. And then they see people across the region being brave and breaking this barrier of fear. And we're inspired because people, movements inspire one another across the country. If we recall, Occupy at this time was inspired by, these uprisings against the Arab regime. So that's the power of people movements. And so the regime decided to react with tear gas. They beat the protesters, and within a few weeks actually sent tanks into the city. That started a snowball effect because people were angered of just like, well, we're just demanding, that we get the reforms we need in order to live better lives. And this is how you react. And slowly that angered more and more people started going to the streets. And then that spread to the rest of the country because the problems in Daraa did mirror problems across the country. As people, as this cost of living was rising empirically. And then again, even though none of these issues necessarily were new issues, because like it was mentioned, these neoliberal policies had meant, the slashing of subsidies and rising expenses for years, people were now seeing that, oh, maybe we can do something about it. We don't have to sit back and accept this. Like, why, if other peoples are feeling brave and going to the streets, maybe we can also do this too. And the regime really failed to understand that context, and that these grievances, again, were shared across the country and that they would spread to major cities. They just assumed we can just shut it down here in this small part of the country. And that's not what happens. And I want to take this moment too to talk about kind of the creativity behind what happened, in these early days of the revolution and uprising, because again, we focus exclusively on the violence, which is important because a lot of people have been killed, a lot of people have been forcibly disappeared, a lot of people have been displaced, but we also don't want to miss the stories of civil disobedience and how this uprising started, because that is such an important part of this as well. There was such an amazing amount of music and poetry that came out of the revolution. The infamous song, Yalla irhal ya Bashar, like, come on, leave Bashar, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام, which became the slogan across, the region of the people want the fall of the regimes. These became the anthems of what the revolution was. And it was, all these kinds of different genres and songs came out. People took action in terms of sit-ins and strikes. So businesses shutting down their stores, students taking action on campuses, a reclamation of public space, which is a big deal because, under Syrian law, like any gathering, I think it was like more than 2 people when under emergency law, was considered illegal. And people were kind of creating now, be like, no, we're going to actually take over this space. This is our space. We're going to take it over. They were rethinking of how they organize. Again, political parties were not allowed to function outside of the Ba'ath party, which was the party in control. So people were like reimagining, okay, what does this mean in our opportunity? And I think it's really sometimes hard to describe like how draconian Syrian society was at the time. Even compared to the other countries in the region. So like even in a place like Egypt, which under Mubarak and now under Sisi is very, very authoritarian, draconian, there was still, at least back then, now not as much, but there's still a little bit of space where, opposition political parties existed, opposition newspapers existed. This was not the case at all in Syria. So anything people were doing was them taking a big risk. And then obviously the visuals and the theaters, the banners, the cartoons, the leaflets, skits, visuals, was so amazing and very creative. And unfortunately the regime, responded back with intense amounts of violence. So like Ibrahim Qashush, who is the one who started this song, Come On Leave Bashar, reports are that his throat was slit, eventually forces. Activists in Damascus at some point stuffed cassette players and speakers with his song in black bags and would like put them in different garbage cans around the city so they can like frustrate regime forces throughout. In Dareya, which was home to a big massacre that happened a few years in, an activist called Riyad Mattar, who was eventually also killed. His idea was like hand out roses to the soldiers as a way to like get them to like, you need to not be on the regime side. You need to be on the side of the people. There were huge sit-ins in places like Homs, even Hama, which again, I mentioned was like this site of this brutal massacre in 1982. Even people went out and started protesting. The cartoon here, by a famous cartoonist called Ali Farzat, also was like, who was a long time in opposition to the regime, but again encouraged to draw more. His hands were broken at some point by regime officials. So this was kind of some of the creativity that they were doing, and the point was disrupting business as usual. The point was, we're gonna take control and we're gonna build alternatives to this regime. So we're gonna build our own media. And we're gonna, take advantage of this people feeling like, oh, we finally have some freedom that we can express ourselves. These local coordination councils, we talk a lot about these last few years under COVID here in the US, people popping up and be like, okay, the government is failing to provide us what we need to do. Let's think about things like mutual aid, how we provide the services we need to protect ourselves to keep us safe. That was, that's what I describe people now as like what the local coordination councils were doing in Syria, just like, the regime is attacking us. The regime never actually provided any of this stuff. We're going to build it ourselves. And it was happening all across the country. And again, that new space that people were hungering for was now happening. And so, yeah, the regime, responded in very very violent ways. And I think it was all about people, people just wanted simple demands, the fall of the regime. They wanted freedom, they wanted justice. And the regime was just like, absolutely not. And so it was a lot of violence. The violence included bombings, the violence included tanks, the violence included, sending soldiers into cities, tear gas, beatings, arresting people, for political reasons. People have fled. And that's, I think, how we got to today's war-torn Syria. And I think that's very important to put very squarely the blame on Assad and his backers in Russia and Iran, because anytime we get confused, just like we're seeing in Ukraine today, of who actually is the problem, that means we can't actually take the real action needed to push back on and to end, because in the end, we all obviously want to end the wars, whether it is in Syria or Ukraine, or wherever else war is going. But to end it, you actually have to be clear about who is responsible for what. And so the responsibility in Syria lies with the regime, with Assad's backers in Russia and Iran. Like I mentioned earlier, like the bombing of hospitals became the norm. And we know it's the norm because they would be specifically given coordinates to not bomb these hospitals, and then they would bomb them anyway. The widespread use of chemical weapons. I know there's been a lot in terms of pro-Russia propaganda, specifically in left spaces about, who actually used chemical weapons, were chemical weapons actually not used. The UN has several times through the OPCW made clear in their various ways that, it's the regime who is responsible for the use of chemical weapons in several cases where people are like, no, we don't, maybe it's the rebel groups, maybe the rebels, gas themselves, as one infamous left journalist once proclaimed. But that's been one of their tactics as well. Like I said, torture, imprisonment, siege, all tactics to destroy the uprising. We're at this point 6 million refugees who have been very clear that they'll not feel safe to return home until Assad is gone. And these refugees are, between Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, places that themselves already are dealing with a lot of economic issues, or host other refugees, such as Palestinian refugees, now having to absorb even Syrian refugees themselves. And deal with that. And, the Syrian Network for Human Rights has, tracks death tolls. And as you can see in this chart, over almost 230,000 civilians killed. The death toll is much higher. I know the last time the UN counted was, I think, close to 500,000. But they stopped counting like very early on in the war. And so I don't think we'll ever kind of get a full scope of the death toll. And yeah, as you can see, the majority are definitely from the regime, and those on the side of the regime. And in addition to this, we have, estimated tens of thousands of people who are political prisoners, forcibly disappeared, that we don't know what their status is. Every couple months, the regime will inform people, oh, your relative has passed away in the prison, or will attempt to do prison, will attempt as a part of negotiating of like, well, we'll release prisoners, but again, people and some people do get released, but it's not clear, where prisoners are. And I know certain families of prisoners were worried with the earthquake, knowing that certain prisons are in the area of like, okay, what happened? Will we ever find out actually if our families survived the earthquake? Maybe they died there. Will we hear it from a few months later that they themselves has passed in this earthquake? And so when we're talking about kind of what has the international response been, sadly, it's been awful. You know, Syria has definitely become a battleground for outside forces. You know, whether, you know, the clear side, obviously, of like Syria with its backing from Iran and Russia being able to pretty much do whatever they want in the country. And then even those who have proclaimed themselves friends of Syria, including the United States, have been very, have not done what is best for Syria, because we know, you know, people do, you know, people have their own geopolitical reasonings to get involved and not involved. And whether it's under Obama or under Trump or now under Biden, it's really been thinking through Syria of just like, how do we potentially support these folks fighting against the regime, but within our own within our own goals. And the goals on Syria have shifted, but I think when Obama, you know, in 2014 declared that there would be, in 2013, declared, because of the chemical weapon attack in Ghouta, that this is the red line that Bashar al-Assad has crossed, and then did nothing about it, I think was very clear to the regime and the regime's allies that the US will let, you know, whatever they want to do happen. And then when he instead started bombing in September of 2014, going after ISIS, I think made, again, very clear that, well, we all have the same goal here of ending ISIS. So if that means we're in some weird alliance together, then that's what we're gonna do. And, you know, it would, you know, it's laughable when you think about times when you hear stories of like, yeah, they would actually coordinate when they're bombing Syria so they don't accidentally hit each other. You know, it's funny and absurd and also really sad in terms of how, you know, these outside forces all decided that the only thing that matters is their own goals, and what the Syrian people want and the people of Syria want does not matter at all in that, in their calculations. And then like, yeah, and it's also a non-response. So the response is, sure, we'll throw in aid and sure, we'll start bombing, you know, based on what we want. But the reality is, again, like what Syrians themselves want, similar, I think, to what we're seeing in conversations around Ukraine, though we'll talk a little bit about the differences, is that, you know, the political agendas of the international players really took center stage. And this idea of terrorism and the war on terror, which is still ongoing, no matter, you know, Obama supposedly ended it. Trump came back and said, we're going to fight terrorists and kill all these terrorists all across the globe. Biden supposedly ended it when he pulled out of Afghanistan. But we know it still continues, that, you know, this idea of like, as long as you're claiming to fight terrorism, you can do whatever you want. Even any state can do whatever they want. And so I think it's, you know, it's sad, because what happens is this means that there's also been an overall lack of solidarity. And so people focus on the geopolitics of everything versus any of the grassroots. You know, people will have entire conferences and conversations and put out things in the media that don't at all center Syrians and what Syrians have been demanding since 2011. The focus is on US proclamations. So the US will proclaim, yes, we support the Syrian people against Assad, but the actions don't actually showcase that. We focus on, amongst the left and progressives, on ideology versus people's humanity. So this is where we have the fights around, you know, well, you know, the enemy of our enemy is our friend kind of, you know, actions. We'll have conversations about, well, you know, we need a multipolar world, and we can get into any of that to like really take, you know, to push back around against US hegemony. Who are we in the US? You'll have the isolationist strands of like, who are we in the US to do anything. We ourselves are hypocrites. Look what we did in Iraq, look what we did in Afghanistan, look at how we support Israel. And so those are the conversations that take center stage versus actually the humanity of Syrians. The fact that, there was a focus. I still remember like when Ghouta happened in 2013 and people were like, no, the anti-war movement in the US was like, this is the opportunity to stop Obama from bombing Syria, and people took to the streets, and then Obama didn't bomb. And then when Obama did start bombing in 2014, silence, these same anti-war folks had nothing to say, because this time that he was bombing ISIS. And somehow or another, the US anti-war movement is okay with bombing ISIS, but not bombing Assad. And then, this idea of like the claim that it's US weapons that are fueling the war versus the actual war criminals fueling the war. Again, similar to what we're seeing now with Ukraine of like, well, if we just stop sending arms, this will stop the war. Instead of like, no, maybe Russia needs to get out. And with Syria, maybe Bashar al-Assad needs to stop and step down like people have been demanding him to do. And I think one thing to note, just like, and now it's the same in terms of just like, Syria being one of the most documented wars. And it's a lesson again for all of us who do anti-war work, who think about how we support people under occupation and authoritarian regimes, of just like, there's so much documentation out there, and that has created space for people to be in solidarity with each other. And also it sometimes has desensitized us. So I throw this out there as just like a question for all of us when we're thinking about how we better do our organizing, of like, what does it mean when there is so much documentation and still it's hard to get the needle moving in terms of actual, support at times for people. It's just like, you feel bad, but then people are like, well, what do we do about it? And one of the most documented wars also means that like the propaganda machine is also as powerful as ever that we see. And again, we saw so much in Syria, the confusion that Putin and Assad have put out there, and now we're seeing it again in Ukraine. And so I think something just in terms of like, and I'll wrap up in the next 10 minutes. And again, I want to have, make space for discussion and conversation. But when people always ask me like, what do we do? What do we do for Syria? And I think I always like to remind people, well, like, again, this concept of solidarity, and it can mean a lot of different things. But always the need to focus on the grassroots versus the geopolitics. The geopolitics are important. I don't want to just like throw them out there as they're not important at all. But for me, when I think about people solidarity, we need to bring back up these grassroots and see what are people continuing to do on the ground to push back against Assad. We can't only pay attention to Syria when we can use it to make a political point. So I think, again, we saw this with the earthquake of just like now all of a sudden, oh, there's Syria's back in the news. So the political point that so many people have decided to make is like US sanctions are bad, instead of like, what's the context? Why are Syrians suffering particularly? What is the more nuanced conversations that need to be had here other than let's blame the United States for what's happening. And then solidarity, I think people are like, well, it's so complicated. I don't know what to say or do. And I tell people like, even acknowledging and connecting with people so people don't feel alone is so important. And there's so many different ways you can do that. So like, if you're a teacher, what are there opportunities to bring in Syria in a lesson plan you're doing? If you're a musician, an artist, like, again, how do you connect with Syrian musicians and artists and what they're trying to like do in support of their own people? If you're in the medical field, how do you do, humanitarian aid work in support of Syrian refugees? So many things. It doesn't have to be more complicated than what you're already, what role you play already in the world, and how you can bring it in when there are opportunities to do that. And I think it's always important to remember that like the Syrian people themselves continue to resist every single day. Protests continue. You don't necessarily always hear about them unless you're like following, folks on social media. But they continue against the regime. I think the latest set of protests, like big ones that happened, was a couple months ago when various Turkish officials declared that like, oh, it's time to like normalize with the Assad regime, and folks, particularly in northwest Syria, took to the streets to say absolutely not, no to normalization. That's not what we want. And their protests have not only ever been against the regime. We know there's a lot of groups, including armed opposition groups, that have not abided by the values of freedom and dignity, the values of the revolution. And so folks have been also protesting against that. It's not only, it's the regime first and foremost, and then the conditions that the regime created have given rise to groups that unfortunately do not at all, abide by these values. And so people have been outspoken against that. And Syrians themselves are seeking to connect across borders and struggles. This is actually one of my favorite murals that folks did in Idlib around in solidarity with George Floyd back in 2000, in the summer of 2000. So this last just couple of minutes, I'm going to focus on specifically on Syria and Ukraine. And I do think, I think it's important, and how we do this in a way that is beneficial and not just like, whataboutism and etc. In terms of just the sad reality of the hypocrisy of the way that Europe and the US have reacted in these last year, and the differences in terms of how folks have reacted to Ukraine versus Syria. I think one of the main things that came out was the open arms, and thankfully folks opened their arms in terms of welcoming Ukrainian refugees. And that was such a stark contrast in terms of how Europe particularly looked towards Syrian refugees and other refugees from Muslim countries, but Syrians being the refugee population that has been one of the largest recently. So in 2015, the EU actually just shut down its borders to Syrian refugees. We had stories of like countries like, the Dutch, for example, there were stories that they were stealing Syrian belongings when they'd arrive, of just like, well, if you have gold, if, they take like the woman's gold and be like, well, you obviously you're not poor enough to be a refugee, but if we take your gold, now you're poor enough, we'll accept you as a refugee. I think there was a story that came out just a couple weeks before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of like Syrians stranded on the Polish borders and Poland refusing to welcome them in. And then like, just a couple weeks later, the invasion happens and Poland's now like, yes, of course, we're welcoming Ukrainian refugees, which is all great. It's wonderful that Europeans did that. But I do think it is, when we have space to critically discuss this in ways that is not about, oh, how dare those Ukrainians get they want, but in ways of like, how do we use this as an opportunity to tell people the way you treated Ukrainian refugees is the way you should be treating all refugees. I think that there needs to be space for that. Obviously the US, Trump came in with his Muslim ban, and also in response to the refugee crisis so many Muslim majority countries have been going through. And then sadly Biden recently, just this past week, suggested draconian policies related to asylum seekers, though we know Ukrainians have been again welcomed in open arms by the United States. So how do we again use this at upper, be like, you need to be treating everyone like you treat Ukrainian refugees from war. We saw the push when the war first started around boycotts and sanctions through Russia, which is again awesome. And then it was also, as someone who worked in BDS for so many years, it was like, wow, people like really can understand it. Why do they refuse to understand it when it comes to Israel, or when it comes to Russia with what Syria did? Like, so they voted to, I think, throw Russia off of the Human Rights Council or suspend them. Awesome. Russia had been doing horrible things in Syria for years. Why was that not action taken? I wish that action had been taken. Russia, all the calls for sports boycott. I mean, Russia in the last 10 years hosted both the World Cup and Olympics. And rarely was there any talk about what was happening in Syria during those two events. And I think, again, we saw the Qatar World Cup that happened, and a lot of the conversations are like, why is Qatar being allowed to host the World Cup considering its human rights violations? And it's just like, great, how do we like talk about these things, in a way that is useful to push people to be better in the way they're covering these things. I do a lot of work currently in my job.
Günaydın babacığım.
I do a lot of work around my work now around tech companies and social media platforms. And also it was surprising to see the YouTubes of the world, the Twitters of the world, obviously this is Twitter pre-Elon Musk, talk about, yeah, we're going to shut down, propaganda, pro-Russia propaganda on our platforms. And again, it was like, wonderful. Again, why was this not the same case when it came to Syria? Or when it comes to Israeli propaganda, re-Palestine, like, what are the lessons learned you all need to take from this and say, we're going to apply them now to all conflicts in the world and all propaganda in the world. And I think the last one I'll mention is just the weaponry, the amount of weaponry that has been passed, to Ukraine, and then when you compare it to what was sent to Syria, especially from the US angle, I think, if you want to, the biggest, I think, pushback in this moment of time, people who still claim that there was a regime change conspiracy funded by the US against Assad, and that's what happened. Like, this is not a legitimate uprising. All you have to do is compare the amount of weapons that the US has sent to Ukraine versus the amount of weapons that the US ever sent to Syria, and the types of weapons. I mean, Obama at some point would refuse to send, I'm not sure the kind of weapon, but any weapons that would actually hit like airstrikes that would stop the airstrikes, refused to send those, told the Saudis they weren't allowed to send those types of weapons. And then also at some point they would give weapons, and then at some point, again in the 2014, 2015, when defeating ISIS became the US priority, what people were given weapons and told these are only to be used against Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they are not to be used against the regime. And so like, it's just, again, like showcases like, when we are able to use this information of what we're seeing in Ukraine to bring more attention back to like, well, this is what the reality was in Syria, and this is how we need to do better. I think those are moments that we should take up. And again, in a way that doesn't make it seem that the Ukrainian people are not deserving of what they're getting. And the fact that like all of this empathy and sympathy that has come out to Ukraine, and still 1 year on, the war is still raging. And it's not getting the attention it's probably still needs to get. And so even with all of that, the war continues. So I think there are moments of time to be like, this is not, it's not the, we shouldn't act like somehow or another that empathy and sympathy ended the war quicker or not. It's still sadly ongoing. And what, again, like questions for us, like, what does that mean if like, even in a place where so much energy has been devoted, and yet it seems like it's still not enough to help people really, really end the war in a way that is best for them and their future in Ukraine. So yeah, I'm gonna stop there. I'd love to hear questions. We'll probably stop sharing my screen just so I can see everyone. But just some like, some resources in general. And I can link some more resources around the earthquake focus ones. But like, these are some books that I usually, share with people if they want to hear. The Home That Was Our Country is written by a Syrian American activist, and her like relationship to her family home back in Syria and what that means as the revolution was starting. Syria Speaks is just a collection of a lot of just like, like here's all the creative actions that were taking place in the revolution. For Sema is a documentary that is about the siege and bombing of Aleppo in 2016. It is a very powerful one. This woman Sema was just Sema's the daughter, and this woman is just like recording every day what life was like under siege and under the bombings. The Cave is about a hospital that was built in a cave in order to protect from the bombings. And then, yeah, these two organizations, again, there's so many organizations, but two I like to highlight. Families for Freedom is specifically for families who have political prisoners. And I think, I think the issue of political prisoners, especially in this moment of time when people in the US are talking a lot about the issues, talking about abolition, talking about, mass incarceration, it seems an opportunity to talk about how these issues, worldwide, the issue of prisoners worldwide is an opening. And then Syria Untold is just, again, a collection of a lot of like civil disobedience and examples and like just daily life for Syrians. Well, thanks everyone for all these. I think I'll start with the sanction ones and work my way back. So I have very complicated feelings about sanctions on Syria. I think I'll start one in general. I think the anti-war folks and leftists in the US who are just like blanket, we're against sanctions are bad automatically. I think we have to be really careful about that because, again, there's a very large call for sanctions against Israel that is very powerful and gaining steam. And I think you have to just be careful in terms of just like the pushing of the making it the like sanctions equal war kind of rhetoric is, I think, dangerous in terms of what we then why are we calling for sanctions against Israel? Like, I think that's very like, we need to complicate the way we've talked about sanctions. And I get it. It comes out of Iraq, comes out of Iran, which, yes, their sanctions are awful. What happened to the US, the sanctions against Iraq were awful, killed many people, destroyed many lives. The way sanctions are being used against Iran, also, I think overall, most grassroots folks that I work with around Iran issues are very clear the sanctions are a problem. So it's also listening to like who is actually impacted. On Syria, the problem I think comes to one, I don't think you can deny that sanctions have caused economic stress to people, particularly people who are living under regime control. My family lives in, like I said, lives in Damascus. The stuff they've had to deal with in terms of prices, inflation, prices going up, struggling to find gas, more, etc. Those are real problems. And I don't think you can deny necessarily that sanctions are part of the problem, but they're also maybe not the main problem. Again, we're talking about a country that has been dealing with war a lot of time. And I think part of the question also becomes of just like when you're in a situation where different parts of the country are dealing with different problems. What does it mean if sanctions potentially may in the future eventually force Assad to step down or force Assad to change, in terms of the siege? He has the siege on Idlib in northwest Syria, but in the long run, that was also impacting Syrians, on the ground themselves. So I do within, the regime held areas. So I understand the reasons behind sanctions. I think both, you can't say they're actually not causing any problems, but you also can't make them those. That's not a clear answer. It's a nuanced answer. But I do think in this moment in time, allowing the Assad regime to claim sanctions are the problem, this is why we're not getting aid, is a problem, and we need to push back on that. And I think we can push back that in a way that's not like sanctions are wonderful. We could push back onto like, in this moment in time, the problem continues to be that the regime is the one who controls what aid comes in and out. And why is it that the UN and other international organizations continue to depend on the regime and not find other ways to get the aid that where it is needed? Because there's been plenty of stories that have come out also on terms of the corruption around, say, the World Food Program or other UN officials who have like been able to like hang out in Damascus and spend money at like regime controlled hotels and benefit the regime while supposedly supporting the Syrian people. So I think those are like it's more complicated than these questions. The whole entire international development world needs to be thinking about why they continue to allow the regime to do what they're doing as wrong. And I do think, like I mentioned, the PayPals and the Venmos in the world, and that is something that I think potentially we can think about, because the corporations are not following the sanctions. Again, they're being overprotective. And so there is no reason that PayPal and Venmo should not allow someone to send money to their family in Syria. They are just claiming, because they're claiming sanctions, but in reality, they're either too lazy, they don't care, or again, they're themselves are Islamophobic and racist and, you know, falling for the rhetoric of just like anyone there is a terrorist. So we're not gonna get in trouble for doing that. So I think there is potential campaigning that people can do around these corporations. And again, I'm a BDS activist. I always love thinking about corporations in terms of why are they succumbing to this type of rhetoric, and not doing the work they need to do in order to ensure that money is being able to get to where it needs to be. In terms of like, so I know there was a lot of in terms of like how to build solidarity, kind of what are the diasporas doing to work with each other. I do think it's happening. I don't think it's happening at a scale that it can be and should be. I think people are really exhausted. I've been part of like starting and then starting again, and then people like be like, we need a break, and then restarting kind of like these ideas around solidarity, particularly people in the region. So a couple of years ago, oh my God, this is now 6 years ago, you know, through War Sisters League, we did a diaspora delegation to Athens, where we took a bunch of people from, so it was folks on there were from Syria, from Iran, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Yemen, and Iraq, and we all went to Athens because Athens has refugee communities from all of these countries. And we just went more of like, we're going to provide translation services, we're going to provide direct aid. And so I think those types of things are happening, again, not at the scale that they're doing. I think there is a lot, and I can drop some, I'll pull those up, but there's a lot of like people doing podcasts or statements together or talks together around diaspora. Again, I think Ukraine and Syria, I've been a part of several now, like kind of like a couple different conversations around these things of like how we can share and learn. And yes, more of that is 100% important and needs to happen. It's how do we create the space? How do we deal with people's exhaustion? For those of us who are in the US, we're dealing with like our own issues in the United States, you know, in addition to like what our families in our homelands are dealing with, you know, with, you know, all the fascism on the rise, which we'll get to a little bit. So, so it's important. I agree with it. It's like, there's something very powerful when you're like sitting around and be like, you know, I'm a Syrian, you're an Iranian, you're a Pakistani, you're Ukrainian, and talking about these things. And the more we do it, we may not see the results immediately tomorrow. But like that, I think you need that in order to then, I think, build up bigger campaigns in the future, because if you don't have those relationships, it gets harder to do that. And I think there are ways, you know, when we talk about, you know, I think the issue of geopolitics came up a couple of times in conversations, and there are times where just like, you know, especially when Linda and Ted, you both discussed about like Russia exhausting itself, you know, and that benefiting other people, which is, you know, I'm now interested in that idea more of just like, what actually has been that impact materially on other, you know, with Russian military being so consumed with Ukraine at this moment. And I think, again, it's like, are there openings in those geopolitical fights that we can use to benefit ourselves? I really, you know, you know, like I'll take an example. So when like, you know, when Israel decides to go and bomb some Iranian military base in Syria, you know, when this last one was bad because it like hit right behind my dad's cousin's apartment. And so it was definitely more, you know, oftentimes it's not as like within really close within a civilian center immediately. It's like more to the side. But like, you know, a lot of times we're like, oh my, you know, it's really hard to be angered when like when various Syrian occupiers are bombing each other, because it's like, okay, whatever, they're killing each other, that's great, like, you know, as long as people, you know, innocent people aren't caught in this drama. Just like I don't like care much when like states are fighting each other, or like state and like agents of state violence are fighting each other. I think a lot about like when January 6th happened, you know, I'm right outside DC, and it's like, okay, the cops and these you know, insurrectionists are fighting each other. To me, they're like on the same side, but whatever, in this moment of time they're fighting each other. But then how's that an opportunity to push forward in the future a fight against fascism? And I think those are that's where I think the geopolitics can be useful. Just like, what are the openings that potentially get created when states are fighting each other, as Russia is exhausting itself in Ukraine, as Israel and Iran are like having their tiffs. As long as we don't forget, again, the people on the ground are who we really need to be centering when we're talking about these things. And as much and more solidarity, we need as much solidarity as we can amongst the people, because we're all fighting. The right wing's on the rise everywhere. Corporations are like profiting off of all of this violence across the globe. State violence is continuing across the globe. And as long as we're building the alternatives, which I think one of the first questions was asked in terms of like, what are we building alternatives to capitalism, which is very important. And how we push back, I still have people who still argue things like Syria is a socialist state, and that's why they like tried to invade it. And it's like, it's 2023. I can't believe we're still having these arguments, So like, I think that's where the political education is so important. Sometimes we think like, no, we need to like just campaign out there. It's like, people are so politically miseducated and purposely so. Like, the beauty of social media that it was 10, 15 years ago, it's very hard to see the beauty of it anymore, honestly, because of the amount of propaganda and misinformation and disinformation out there. And that is purposefully, I think, shutting down any good, well-intentioned leftist, socialist, progressive activism, because they are going after them in terms of like, yeah, Syria's socialist, that's why they're going attack, Ukraine is just a bunch of right-wingers, that's why, Russia is just denazifying Ukraine, that's good, isn't it? And so like, I think that political education part is so important. And as long as, and how do we expand that? How do we continue to bring in more people into that space? Even people who don't necessarily think like, oh, I care about this thing. What it is the working class? What is, people of color communities across this country who just like, who understand fundamentally these issues because they're dealing with them. And how we continue to build the organizing and the organizations who can bring them into these spaces. And why I think the last point I make before I let people, so like, I think the point about like, I've gone back and forth of just like the orgs, the socialist leftist orgs in the US, and I'm sorry, this is very US centric at this moment, but like, what are the orgs that are, and the media outlets that are worth continuing to engage and try to bring in, and which are the ones that are like, forget it. This is useless time. So like, yeah, the Democracy Nows of the world who like really frustrate me sometimes, and also I think like are still worthy of us engaging with them, versus like the gray zones of the world, which you just need to ignore at this point and move on, or like I don't know, I go back and forth on the DSA. Is DSA something we should be talking to? What does it mean for like how are we engaging in sure, Black Agenda report and oh my God, whatever the group involved with them are those folks? Probably not, but like, we have so much more activism around BLM in this country. How are we using this as an opportunity to so across the struggle, immigrant rights groups, etc. Like, there's been so much activism in a post-Trump era. And it's, I think, important to like engage when we can within those spaces as well.
Okay, Frank, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question on solidarity within Syria. You haven't talked about the role of the Kurdish community, and I just was wondering, what is the sort of the status and the relations going on with the Kurdish community? Because I remember they were under attack from Turkey at some points in that war there. And also, one other question would be in terms of Iran. Has the rebellion in Ramah, Iran also helped give space to the struggle within Syria?
Okay, on James next, because I've already spoken once. James, go ahead, and then I'll come back to myself. James, you're here. You're muted. Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Could you speak a little bit more about how you think the insurrectionists and the police on January 6th were on the same team?
Excuse me, losing my voice here. Yeah, yeah, this is just a, since the earthquake happened in Turkey and northern Syria, I couldn't help but remember that the earthquake in Nicaragua in, I believe it was 1979, was the final straw that broke the camel's back of the Nicaraguan revolution at that time, because Somoza pocketed all the aid money and people were just, that was it, that was the end. And so I know that, losing my voice, sorry. I know that the conditions, as Ramah has described, and as we all know, in Syria have been extremely difficult, but I did wonder to what degree the fury internationally amongst those of us who support the Syrian revolution will push more in that direction if it becomes very clear, more and more clear as time passes, that the aid money that is going into Syria is going into the pockets of Assad and his supporters, and the potential impact of that to bring more solidarity and support to the Syrian revolution. Okay. So
I
Sean,
don't think that really addressed my question.
oh no, I wasn't answering your question, James. I was speaking on something else. I was calling on myself as the chair. No,
I'm sorry.
Ramah. Yeah, it's okay. No, Ramah, we'll come back to you. We'll come back to you. I want to call on Shian and then we'll go back to Ramah.
Yeah, I hope to keep this short, even though it's a very complicated issue. I want to reinforce the importance of the Kurdish community here, and it has to be acknowledged that we are talking about Syria, but just like the cases of Turkey and Iraq, there are really at least two countries there. I mean, there's the colonized Kurdistan, and the earthquake has made this all way more difficult because places like Afrin are now doubly colonized. I mean, Afrin is a part of Kurdish Syria now under Turkish occupation. So it's like an awful picture, and no aid can get into Syria. To Afrin. So aid into Syria is already very difficult, and now the Turkish army, the Turkish soldiers are preventing the aid like doubly so. So that's an awful picture. Yeah, so I just wanted to underline that.
Okay, Ramah.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. And yeah, we both say Syria is not complicated because it's clear there's an oppressor and oppressed, and then it's also you need the nuance, you need the complication, because there are many different communities in Syria. It is not only it's not only the Syrian Arabs in the country. There's many other communities, including Kurdish folks who themselves have been demanding an end to their colonization, freedom for their lands across Kurdistan, which is Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and thus face doubly many various oppressions from the regime, from the Turkish authorities. ISIS was a major factor as well for several years. At this, and I'm sure others may have more to share, and I'm happy to share more, but I think, when we talk about the mistakes that some revolutionary groups or opposition groups to the regime made, certain groups very much tied their future to Turkey, which meant their any sort of potential solidarity and alliances with Kurdish groups ended right there, as Turkey is an oppressor of Kurdish communities. And so again, how do we create that space to talk about those mistakes, about what is and is not actually, what requires true solidarity with folks who are facing many oppressions, not only that one oppression. We can talk about that in terms of women in the revolution. We can talk about that in other kind of marginalized and minority groups within the revolutionary itself. Some folks have talked about that the weaponization of the revolution, whether it was not most most people will probably say it was necessary. You had to eventually, you couldn't just sit down and not fight back. But that relegated many women activists to the sidelines, because many times weaponizations means the men take charge versus women. And so I do think like these are nuances that need to be discussed. A couple of years ago when certain, Kurdish areas made peace with the regime, because in their mind, it was like, we'd rather be under regime control than Turkish control. And so that's the reality. And then the extra now, the earthquake bringing even more complication to the situation, because you can't even, because of Turkey, because of the regime, because of even, some tension between northwest part of Syria as well as Kurdish parts of Syria, is complicating, aid even more. And so I think it's, how do we have those nuanced conversations in ways that, again, does not lose track of the fact that we are in this space because forces, mostly state forces, have decided that like our geopolitical needs matter more than what the people themselves require and need. And in terms of this moment of just like, is this an earthquake? Will people, I don't know, I hear very like, people really live very different lives in certain parts of Syria. Like, again, like I haven't been to Syria since August 2010 was the last time I've been there. I have family in Damascus. I have family in Hama. We rarely talk politics on the phone, honestly. Fear, many different reasons, I understand. But like, then I see like, I'll see photos of like nightclubs open in Damascus, like things are fine, and you're like, what is going on, like, and I think that's the reality. I don't think that's like unique to Syria as a war zone. I think many war zones, potentially are like this. So yeah, I mean, I think people need to continue to be angry, yes, and get angry. I do think the regional, I think something that, the region is tired in general, like, and what is going to be the next spark, I think even early on in the years when things got violence across the region, like it was still like, okay, but people did rise up. It's harder to keep that excitement, like Sisi in Egypt is just awful. Tunisia was just like the one hope, I think, that like continued. There was a coup a few months ago or last year, and the new president at this moment is just a very, like, there's been protests recently because he's been putting out proclamations and very anti-Black and anti-Africa like proclamations recently. So like, Iraq continues to, weather the storm of post-US occupation. Yemen, things have a little bit gotten better in Yemen in terms of there isn't daily Saudi and bombing or from the UAE, but it's like still like so much poverty post that campaign. Bahrain, Libya, like things are in a bad shape. And I think we can hold on to like, well, things were bad and people got a spark and rose up. But we also now see the impact, how the regimes reacted. So I think that's in people's memories in terms of that violence. And the fact that now the regimes are openly normalizing with each other. It's not a shock that the Emirates and, and Bahrain, like, signed these normalization deals with Israel, or that Saudi is like thinking about doing so, and that there's like open dialogue, like I think that it's being done in the open is a new phase. That's kind of scary, honestly, because it means, and obviously, and the normalization with Israel is happening hand in hand with the normalization of Assad, which I think is very fascinating for people who are like, Assad is like the anti-imperialist, anti-Israel. It's like, no, like Israel knows this is all happening. They don't care. They don't mind Assad. They really don't mind Assad at all, because Assad is better than like the people themselves being in power. And like, there's like, the popular opinion of the region is still that, Israel is a regime that should not exist as is, and the Palestinian people deserve, their freedom and liberation from Zionist control. And so like, I think the fact that the regimes seem to have learned their lessons of like, well, we need each other, is kind of scary. And so So yeah, I want to be hopeful, and I am hopeful because I do see people talking to each other. Someone brought up the question of, if the Iran, if what the uprisings in Iran, how have they been impacted on Syria? I haven't, maybe others know more. I have not seen too much open kind of conversation. Other in the US, yes, I've seen diaspora communities talk about that. But I don't think, Syria has not been a moment of something that folks in Iran have been protesting around necessarily. And understand, again, you're living in a brutal, in a dictator regime. So what does that mean in terms of what you are and are not able to fight back on? But hopefully that is another opening for people to like make that connection of just like, this is what, Iran has done XYZ in Syria. Hopefully they don't, the lessons learned of like the violence that they used in Syria against the Iranian protesters themselves. And then, yeah, James, your last point I'll answer in terms of just like the police and protesters being on the same side. I come from an abolitionist framework of like, the police are, the forefront of protecting white supremacy and capitalism in this country. And so like, I think there are moments in time when police and, whites and insurrectionists and white supremacists will be seen to fighting, but we've also seen many, many examples of where police themselves are actually the white supremacists, or police themselves would like shut down protesters against white supremacy, but then allow the white supremacists to protest as they please. So I think that's just like that point being of just like, there are moments when it's like, okay, well, let the police, fight back those insurrections in that day. That might be an opening us to talk about things, very openly, more openly, but let's not forget in the end of the day, policing and what its role in this country is really is steeped in, anti-Black racism and white supremacy.
Okay. I feel like we're coming to a natural conclusion of this meeting. And it's been just tremendously rich in terms of what we've learned or what I've learned, and the discussion around solidarity and what we can do to continue to support the Syrians. So I think that I don't see any further hands raised. So unless there's any pressing issues, we will wrap this up. This has been recorded. It will be available to watch on our YouTube channel. I'm assuming that everybody that found their way here today is aware of our link tree, our Facebook page for the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign. We're on Twitter. And of course, we want to continue to build solidarity with all the different, movements in resistance with tyranny and fascism here and around the world. And that's the work that we're doing. So thank you so much to everyone. And thank you so much, Ramah. It's been great to meet you. And I know that we'll see each other again on this path. We'll leave the Zoom link open for people who want to capture the links that are there. And please donate generously today and in the future. And it's a human tendency to respond to an emergency, but the ongoing need for revolution is an ongoing emergency, so we try not to ignore. Like, oh yeah, today it's the Syrians, tomorrow it's the Ukrainians, et cetera, et cetera. So everybody have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.